Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new series. I'm not exactly sure what we're going to call it. We're currently calling it like Press Hypercritical or Hypercritical WP, but I mean, the name kind of gives away what we're doing here. We're going to tease apart some stuff related to both WordPress and online business, and just be, that one step more critical about what's happening in the space. And as you can see, I have a wonderful co-host here, my co-founder, partner, yeah, but not life partner, David Krug, who I work with at Press Titan, and he is well known for being critical of things. In our day-to-day discussions about what's happening in the space that we work in, he is very critical. And previously, in a previous life, he wrote articles and discussed very critical looks at technology and WordPress. So I think he's the perfect person to come in here and help us discuss these things. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for kicking this thing off, Malcolm.
Yeah, so I think the first thing we should talk about, because we're old guard, we've been around in WordPress forever. We've seen it from the early like pre 1.0 days to now, is the bloating of the software. And this is something that I've talked about for years. WordPress is getting fatter. I mean, you've probably seen that in your day-to-day use, but are those features worth the bloat? Like, that's really where I want to kind of come at this from.
It's crazy. I was actually working in a older version of WordPress today. Um, what I mean by older is it's still in the 4 point dot dot range, and I was noticing how many of the features I don't use in WordPress, and going, this doesn't make any sense anymore. Like, I don't use a lot of various features. I rarely use pages. I'll use like 4 or 5 pages. That's great. Why does it have to be separate than posts? Why can't we just have that kind of the same thing?
Yep.
And just, I don't know. There's just so many things like that. Like tags, I've never used tags. There's so many things, like most of us, the average users, we don't use in WordPress. So you're right. It's
Yeah, I mean, the recent change with WordPress 5.2 is adding in the site health check feature, and that's a great idea in concept, right? A tool that can make it so that WordPress doesn't crash when you upgrade plugins, upgrade themes, or upgrade WordPress core. But did that need to be part of WordPress core? We're already seeing Jetpack apply new updates to Jetpack that takes advantage of this functionality, so that Jetpack, whenever it updates things or changes things, will make sure that it doesn't crash your entire site. Well, that to me says that it could have been unbundled. It didn't have to necessarily be part of core. They could have, done some of the structure in WordPress core to kind of make sure that those checks are available. But maybe the majority of this could have been moved outside of WordPress core. And I think that is a comment that WordPress has had forever, right? We've always looked at things and go, do we really need that? I mean, custom post types exist as an option. And as you mentioned, do we need separate areas for WordPress posts and pages? Why not just have a toggle when you're developing a piece of content that lets you select, the content type, right? And I think that's a really good way of doing things in terms of not only the code base of WordPress, which we'll talk about a little later, but in terms of kind of that visual flow for users. I don't know about you, but some of my menus, when I have plugins installed, it's like 30 things down the left-hand side, and then each of those have like 5 submenus. It gets really convoluted. And even default vanilla WordPress has a lot of sub-menu items where you're digging around trying to find things. Have you ever had to go searching for something that you couldn't find because of all those menus?
It absolutely. And the other thing is there's no uniformity in where plugin developers actually put their menu. Sometimes it'll be under settings, sometimes it'll be under tools, sometimes it'll be under plugins, sometimes it'll be under appearance. And like trying to explain where a menu is to, not an advanced user like us who use it every single day, but a business owner who uses it every now and then, and try to explain to them where one specific plugin menu is. It doesn't make sense for the average user. And my solution, going back now multiple generations of WordPress, has always been, well, we have plugins. Why don't we also have like core add-ons?
Mm-hmm.
So things that we wouldn't use or don't think we need, you could just deactivate it. Okay, I don't want XML RPC. Okay, deactivate. I don't need multiple pages, post types. I can just have, I love one. Can I just turn all the other functionality off? Just so many things like that.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up, because on like our business website, I remember back when we first started developing it, you installed like 5 or 6 plugins, and their name started with the word disable, right? It was like disable XML RPC, disable like emojis and like, all that stuff, like disable this, disable that. And, when I saw those in that list, I thought, okay, this is kind of ridiculous. Like maybe WordPress needs to start with those things not included and then add them on later. And I think another one of those kinds of things is actually the included plugins and themes. WordPress ships with 3 default themes right now, and it ships still with Akismet and Hello Dolly.
No.
And I mean, does it need those things as part of the install process? Does it need those things as part of kind of the base version of WordPress that everyone gets?
Well, here's one of the issues, specifically like for a Kismet, for example. And Hello Dolly is just silly. We just need to retire that one to begin with. But for me, like a Kismet, for example. So WordPress core, WordPress, as a whole, especially with the addition of Gutenberg as its main builder, the blocks idea, core concept, is shifting away from blogs to being a fully functional CMS, enterprise CMS, public CMS, whatever you want to call it. Like it's shifting that direction, and not blogs, or as the originally started out blogs. So you needed comment functionality, but I think a lot of business users, they don't really use comments in when they're building their business sites. So why are we still shipping a Kismet?
Are you
And
saying maybe we should even strip out comments as one of the core features of WordPress?
again, I think it could reimagine WordPress to where it's like you have the core functionality. Oh, great! You want to add comments? Great! Here's this add-on. We don't even have to call it a plugin. We can just call some of these core functionalities that we have right now that a lot of people, end users, don't use. Just call them add-ons. Just okay, add on a plugin add-on. You want to add plugins? Great, you can add plugins. If you don't want to use plugins at all, you don't have to add them. If you don't, if you don't want comment functionality, you don't have to have comment functionality. You don't want to use RSS feeds? Great, no problem. You don't have to use RSS feeds. And just having the ability to have that separate use types would be awesome. And I think that's where they're missing out. They can make this really lightweight at core and then just add in some of these other functions that add so much weight to the average WordPress install.
Now, of course, the flip side of that is Jetpack, right? So Jetpack is kind of this all-in-one plugin suite that Automatic creates that does a million different functions. And some people have actually compared that to the model that you're talking about, right? You have WordPress as it exists today, then you install Jetpack, and you can check on and off the functionalities that you want from Jetpack as kind of like a single core plugin that side loads in a bunch of other functions and features. And you and I are both very anti-Jetpack. And so when you talk about kind of this slimmed down, sleek, fast WordPress, and then you talk about having kind of these core options that you can kind of toggle on and off, aren't you kind of worried about that potential Jetpack experience, that that bundling of these core features and functionalities that don't necessarily work as well as we think they should, or maybe aren't as developed to be as performant as kind of core WordPress?
Am I worried that they're going to gain a large market share? No. I think they're going to gain a large market share. It's not something you should worry about. They're going to gain a large market share. But is it the best? Is it the best solution to what advanced users, designers, developers need? Probably not. But for someone who's trying to DIY a solution, it might be the best solution that they know how to do. Like,
Right.
okay, you want to add comments? Great. Here's a checkbox you can click in Jetpack that'll add comment functionality via Automatic's comments. I know they own a couple comment companies, so it's one of theirs,
Right.
or one of their partners via Discuss, whatever it might be, where they're adding some of that functionality in. And you see that already with like stats. You see that already in various different parts. So it doesn't bother me. Jetpack bothers me if it would come pre-bundled.
Right.
Like if the whole thing was just bundled in and you couldn't do anything about it, then it would bother me. But the fact that a user can opt out of it, yeah. It still kind of bothers me that a Kismet which is a commercial plugin, does get bundled because it's basically just the gateway to Jetpack. So that kind of bothers me a little bit because there's actually some other spam prevention tools that really work well. My favorite one is disable comments. Again, you know what I mean?
So going back to kind of WordPress core, so today I downloaded every version of every major version of WordPress from 4.3 all the way to 5.2. And you can watch the file size of the zip actually get a little bit bigger with each release. The WordPress 4.3 release was just under 7 megabytes, and the WordPress 5.2 release was just under 12 megabytes as a zip file. When you unzip them, you get WordPress 4.3 being 18 megabytes, and you get 5.2 being over 40 megabytes. And while that doesn't sound huge in terms of the scale of hard drives in the modern world, that's over twice as much in terms of file size. And most of that has come from JavaScript, which is not always the fastest language to be processed and used on a client side, right? So we're seeing a lot of this contributed from the 3 default themes. We're seeing a lot of this from Gutenberg. We're seeing a lot of this from the other JavaScript fancy functions that they're adding to WordPress. And I have to wonder, these transitions, these JavaScript fancy things, do they really add, that much to the user experience? We can argue Gutenberg forever. It's still not done, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but an actual doubling of the file size for the CMS in less than 5 years.
The other thing with it is the size is one issue. The other one is just the complexity that has been added in over the last 12 months that doesn't, even as an advanced user, it kind of just makes me shake my head a little bit. And where are we going? Is another 12 months we're going to see it double again? Are we going to continue to see this double and double and double? What are we looking at in another 10 years? And I think that as a community, we need to take a step back for a second and say, okay, Gutenberg's been good. I'm going to give it that. And some of these changes have been good. I can see some of the goodness in them. However, I think we're headed towards disaster in terms of the average business user. It's headed towards disaster because it's getting too complex. And that's like the reason that WordPress was so awesome. There was other CMSs on the market.
Lots of them.
Over the years, there's been lots of them. But what made WordPress great was how simple and easy it was to use.
Now that's a really funny point, right? Because when we started with WordPress, the technical side, the software side of WordPress was very simplistic, but the barrier to entry for the average user was very high. They didn't understand how to set up a database. They didn't understand how to install WordPress or configure the WP config file. They didn't understand how to install a plugin. They didn't understand how to update core. And then over time, we've watched as the complexity of the software, the scripting, PHP, database, and all that stuff has increased, and the barrier to entry for a user has decreased. But
Right.
now you're talking about the fact that we might reach a tipping point where all of the new developers that want to join WordPress, that learning curve to be able to kind of develop and be part of that part of the community is now so high that you're going to see kind of a waning, right? And we're already seeing this with different new CMSs that are coming out that are based off of JavaScript, like Jekyll and things like that. We're seeing that in terms of Classic Press kind of forking off of WordPress and going, whoa, we got to focus on businesses. We got to focus on kind of that core simplicity model. And so I agree with you that we're hitting that tipping point now where WordPress is so easy. Anyone can install it, one-click installer, all these things. But to develop in WordPress has now gotten really complex and kind of a little convoluted, and leaving probably a lot of entry-level and early mid-tier developers behind.
Well, not only that, when you have, there's an interesting series of videos by you might say it's a radical perspective, but I'm not so sure. It's Chris Pearson has this concept way out there, maybe on the right-hand side of everything, that there's so much technical debt being shoved into each page through Gutenberg that you almost need a developer. Like the average, a serious business would need a developer to maintain all that.
Right.
And this was kind of the point of WordPress, was that you don't need a serious high-end developer, because you probably were. So you were a developer, that's how it started. But then they wanted to make WordPress more popular to the average user, blogging community, the mom and pop business community, that you can install WordPress, grab a theme, blah, 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 and just, you can rock out a website really quick and easy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the goal. That was the essential underlying goal too of Gutenberg. But I think after using Gutenberg for a while now, I'm getting the gut feeling that it's not that way, even for the average user. I mean, we deal with this people all the time in our business, where people, average users, not super technical, just have a laptop they're using at home to run their business. They're having a hard time with Gutenberg.
Yeah.
They weren't super technical to begin with, and WordPress worked, and they had it working. Now they're using Gutenberg, and that functionality, that complexity of WordPress that has changed over the last 18 months. And I'm not just talking Gutenberg, I'm talking everything between menu depth. Menu depth is overwhelming sometimes, because
Yeah.
now just having, 15 plugins installed on a website, you don't know where all the files are, you don't know where all the buttons to push are. It's like having a car and you've loaded it with so many dashboard buttons and things, they don't know where to find it. And then not only new buttons, but they've rearranged all the old buttons, and you're just like, what's going on? And the average user, I think, is going to be overwhelmed, and you're going to see people quitting using WordPress because of that, or just
Yeah.
being
Yeah. Or I mean, we laugh because it's our business, but the growth in, WordPress maintenance, the growth in WordPress development, the growth in kind of that WordPress help area has exploded, especially over the last year to 2 years. And I think part of it is because of that increasing use complexity. So they've lowered the barrier for entry in terms of like installing WordPress and like basically getting started with WordPress. But the learning curve now to actually like execute on your vision has increased. And it doesn't even necessarily translate, right? Like when you go from the old visual editor to Gutenberg, or when you go from visual builders like Elementor to Gutenberg, the knowledge and language and use cases and ways of doing things don't translate, and so you're kind of lost, and you have to learn again, and it feels like a whole new system, and people don't like that. I mean, even when we upgrade Windows or Mac OS and there's major changes, people don't like that. And sometimes it's necessary and sometimes it's not. And I think you bring up a really good point with the technical debt piece. I think that, for example, the WP options table, I don't know how many times you and I have face palmed over the WP options table, because it's basically, if you don't know where to shove something in a WordPress database, and you don't have to be technical, if you don't know where to shove something in a WordPress database, you just throw it in WP options. And that gets, going back to kind of the bloating of WordPress, that options table, that throw everything in here table, is bad. It's really, really sad, really frustrating, and just part of legacy WordPress that developers have to deal with and don't really care about so much, right? That information architecture in the database, the information architecture of your content, the information architecture of, even just user roles, just has not really been refined in such a way that it's easy to use. But going back to Gutenberg, I mean, that's the second thing we want to talk about today. There's the Gutenberg accessibility audit that was done, and everyone assumed that, it was probably going to be bad, but they thought, oh, the updates to Gutenberg have taken care of most of these issues. I'm sure Gutenberg is going to be fine when they do the audit. And Krug, was it fine?
absolutely not.
So you looked at an article related to like a university in the States, right? Talking about this audit?
Right. So one of the things is, part of what we do in our business is just around education. So I'm always curious, I dealt with quite a lot of educators and whatnot, and one of the things that they have to do is they have to make sure that their university websites and web pages and everything are accessible to all students, not just the students that can read regular. They need everything,
Right.
everyone, and without even doing the audit, I noticed the changes and how things were not the same as they used to be, from both sides, from the editor side, and also from the what's being published on the page side. But North Carolina State did a Gutenberg accessibility audit response, and honestly, I've never read a single thing that they've ever written on their site, and I was kind of shocked at some of how many things that they pulled out. Um, you know, really, they focused a lot on the editing experience,
Mm-hmm.
and I really didn't think of it too much. And I haven't read. It's a 329-page report. This Gutenberg audit.
Yeah.
Time to go through it all, but it's overwhelming. I think how big of a fail it was.
Yeah, so I've only gone through the executive summary and the testing plan, and Tenon did a really good job, really detailed, really informative. And as I'm going through this, I'm kind of like, okay, I mean, it's bad, but how bad is it really, right? And they give some really interesting numbers. Gutenberg was in the top 30% worst performing products tested by this same accessibility team. And 69% of the issues were medium or high severity. And there wasn't just a few issues. There was a lot of things going on there. People with mobility issues, people with vision issues, comprehension issues, like learning disabilities, things like that. They struggled with Gutenberg doing very simplistic things, right? It was like add a block of content, bold some text, add a title. Like it was not groundbreaking, like build me a complex page with like all like sliders and like, make sure there's like this profile or block quotes and all this stuff. It was very simplistic things. And the overall review basically said, in terms of accessibility, it falls under not acceptable.
Absolutely. I have to say this. I am an advanced WordPress user, but I have vision problems. Not all the time, but specifically if I work and I'm tired and I have one eye that's not as good vision and it tends to fail me if I've worked too long. But I literally cannot use WordPress on the back end on a tablet anymore. I try to stretch it so I can see everything, and then all of a sudden the sliders break, everything breaks. You can't do anything. You can't use it. It's broken. Nothing you can do. So it's not tablet friendly anymore. I used to be able to grab my tablet and just boop, boop, boop. I could type, I could write a whole blog post. I could do it on my phone. I can't do either one right now.
Yeah.
Either one. You can't come in and make a lot of quick changes. It's just not possible.
And there's been issues with like copying and pasting text. Sometimes it creates like each paragraph will create a separate block. Sometimes it won't. There's been issues with the classic block, so to speak, in terms of updating old pages using Gutenberg. All this functionality that we've gotten accustomed to over the years, since the visual editor was introduced, a lot of that knowledge is kind of thrown out the window. One of the issues that we've been seeing is how Gutenberg plays with plugins, right? Sometimes it doesn't work well. Sometimes it creates conflicts. Sometimes the plugins end up taking over the whole screen and your Gutenberg editor block is like this tiny little thing. And you have to, then we get a contact where it's like, how do I make it so I can see Gutenberg better? Then they full screen it and don't know how to get out as full screen, or we tell them, click on the little 3 dots or widget icon and go to visual options and disable all the things that you don't need. That's like, they sometimes need that, right? Like even popular plugins like Yoast SEO, you enable that and it adds some meta boxes to the Gutenberg page that shrinks the editor window size, like where you can actually edit text and content. And so then you're kind of, if you already have issues with like mouse movement or keyboard shortcuts or vision, or contrast understanding, you might not know where to click or be able to click on the things that you need to be able to do to edit a page or post in WordPress. And that's a huge step backwards. Huge.
Well, I think this goes to a moral and ethical dilemma, really, in my opinion. Because if you look at some issues, we talk about technical debt, and we get that. We understand technical debt. We may not agree upon the pros and cons of all that. We might say, well, Pearson's just exaggerating. We don't have any technical debt because everything's going to be fine. We're going to keep advancing this technology forward, so there's no debt to be had. Okay, Let's just say that's the path you're taking. But now you're talking about groups of people that, for example, if you have visual impairment issues, or if you have auditory issues, and let's just talk about it from an editor's standpoint first, or if you have learning disability and you've spent a good portion of the last 5 to 8 years learning WordPress, and then you introduce this new technology, it better be better,
Yeah.
or you're kind of a skunk. You know what I mean? Like, if you don't introduce technology that's better, then you miss the point. Because every other piece of software out there, the technology that they add in makes things better. You look at when Apple introduced the iPhone, the phone was better. You look at when, when Windows makes an OS advancement. For the most part, their technology is better.
Yeah.
When people, like, for example, I have a Surface Pro, and it was really cool because I used to always touch my screen when I'm trying to do something. And now I can actually touch my screen to make things move. If I need to zoom in, I can quickly just grab it and zoom. And the problem, I think, with WordPress, with this Gutenberg accessibility thing, is it didn't take into moral account the amount of intellectual loss and maybe emotional strife that it's actually going to cause people who have learned this software, given they're all do it to overcome their learning disabilities or their handicaps or whatever it might be in their lives, to learn that, and then it's all thrown away and they're left with technology that's not even better right
But
now.
but Krug, they're all saying, there's the classic editor plugin that you can install, and then you don't have to deal with Gutenberg. You can just stick with the old visual editor.
Okay, so I'll take that, and you're partially right, but we've already seen that the classic editor doesn't work a lot of the times on new plugins that are being updated. It's not compatible. It's not compatible with some certain new themes that are being rolled out. It's not compatible with certain SEO plugins that are out there, and there's conflicts already with classic editor and these existing pieces of this existing technology, and there's conflicts. And again, so you can say that you make this excuse, well, you have classic editor experience, but that still doesn't fill the void. It might
Yeah.
work if you're lucky. There's no guarantees.
Well, and to be fair, as much as they keep kind of pounding everyone over the head with the whole classic editor thing, one, it doesn't really excuse how poorly accessibility was put into Gutenberg. And number two, you and I both know that upcoming versions of WordPress will extend Gutenberg's code base into other areas of WordPress. They've already started working on changing widgets into blocks. They're talking about the navigation menu control. So if you want to add a nav menu, it's going to be Gutenberg block soon. And this audit really shows that accessibility wasn't thought about when originally developing Gutenberg. And so to add it in now is going to take a huge amount of work. And who's going to pay for that? Who's going to put in the time? Who's going to make that happen? And will that work be done before Gutenberg continues to kind of extend its tendrils into other areas of WordPress?
Oh, there's no doubt that I don't believe that people care enough to make it happen.
Well, there's a vocal minority that are fairly loud about this. I mean, there was a lot of money raised to make sure that this accessibility got done. There were some companies that jumped in to make sure the funds were there so that Tenon could be paid to do this. But the news cycle is very short, right? So will they continue to care? I don't know, but I would like to see this be a major priority going forward for WordPress developers. I would love to see Automatic kind of jump in and really kind of make this their key development point going forward. I know that Matt and much of the team kind of steering WordPress right now are thinking about, they spent a bit of time doing triage because Gutenberg really absorbed a lot of development focus for a while. But I hate to say it, maybe we put kind of new feature releases on pause for a bit and really go back and make WordPress the best, most accessible product for publishing content that exists right now. That would be a great claim to fame, don't you think?
I think it would. Again, I don't think that that's really possible right now. I don't think it's possible. I mean, you look at the accessibility audit, basically says in clearer words, this product fails, essentially. Like, so if you take a failed product and you try to patch it, and they can fix a lot of things. I think they have fixed quite a lot of these things already. They fixed a lot of the things, but these are fixes. Unfortunately, this should have been thought out and designed ahead of time. And I think that's the failing. And part of it's the failing of how this of the whole Gutenberg process has been shoved down our throats in some ways. It's like they should have been taking this product and testing it in the beginning before
Right.
they're shooting it at us. And unfortunately, WordPress doesn't really work that way. WordPress is, hey, here's this new update. Here's how this is going to work. And they shove it at you. And then later we try to fix it. And unfortunately, I think with accessibility, it doesn't really work that way. Life doesn't work that way for people who have these learning disabilities, for people that have visual disabilities. They get frustrated. They'll walk away. It becomes inaccessible. It becomes unusable. It becomes a dead product to them. And I think that's what WordPress is looking at doing to a large group of people who use their product. And it's sad. And we're just talking about the back end. We could go into the front end too. What happens when you take an out-of-the-box theme and you start pumping Gutenberg into it? Blocks, for example.
Right.
I've already seen some blocks.
Especially third-party blocks, right? Because Gutenberg was built to be extendable. So there's all of these third-party blocks that exist that output, what code they think they need to output.
Exactly. And do they work with every theme? No, they do not. Do they work with some of the standard themes?
Right. Do they work with screen readers? Do they have like high contrast options for people that have, discrepancy issues in terms of their vision? Do they, yeah. And the answer is no. I mean, the code that they output is the code that the block developers think was important and not necessarily in terms of accessibly important.
Right. And sometimes you have like video auto playing because of a JavaScript conflict, or sometimes captions don't work because some conflict on the page. There's other things, when you try to expand the page, again, the blocks break. It's frustrating, and I think the front end is just as difficult because not only are you talking about, so when you're talking about editor, you're talking about one group of people building websites, and the end user also. For example, I go to a website and I try to spread the text. Let's say if I'm trying to read something close up, if I can't do it, if Zoom doesn't work, if Zoom breaks everything, I give up. I move on to the next site. Goodbye. And I think they're also, so as a software, they're at risk. And again, this whole concept of blocks being the solution, it's great in concept, but when you have all these different developers plugging in all these different types of blocks into the ecosystem, they might not all be compatible. Some might be, but I think if you're going to approve them in the plugin, the WordPress.org plugin repository, I think you have to start asking that question. Does it pass muster? Is it accessible? And why are you approving it if it's not accessible? I think that's one thing they could do right now to really make that an important part. Is this accessible to all users, not just the ones that we're not just approving this because it's safe, but is it actually accessible for everyone?
Now, kind of going back to our previous discussion though, accessibility raises that barrier for entry in terms of being able to develop for WordPress. I don't know about you, but I am not an accessibility expert. I might, understand some basics of how accessibility is supposed to work. I might understand some code in terms of making something more accessible, but in terms of implementing wide accessibility or following kind of the world standards in terms of web accessibility, I'm no expert. I think most people developing blocks or plugins or themes are not experts. Most people developing in WordPress are not experts. And so that knowledge isn't really a big part of the community. And I worry that, it's going to be very hard to turn this around in terms of a community-wide approach. And I hope something like Tide, which is an automated code review system that's slowly being developed for WordPress, It was part of XWP's suite of products that they were developing. Then I think Automatic now owns it or something. But Tide is going to be integrated into the WordPress.org theme and plugin repository someday in the future, and it will do automatic code checks against like a whole bunch of different requirements. And I think one of them definitely should be at least kind of this a certain level of accessibility, but we're still not there yet. And I worry about the knowledge, and I worry about the technology. And I mean, they have a long way to go. And the funny thing is, I mean, as much as we complain about this, the options are fairly limited. If you work for a company or you work for a business, or you want to kind of use the tool that that's powering 1/3 of the web, you're gonna have to use WordPress. And I feel really bad for anyone who has seen their time to publish content or their time to read content double, triple, quadruple because of these changes.
And I think that, ultimately WordPress, because they do power 1/3 of the internet, now has a greater moral responsibility to make this a serious point of issue. So I'm glad that this audit was done. Okay, great. I would love to see a serious plan of action taken by both WordPress.org as a community and by Automatic as one of the leaders in that community, and also other agencies saying, hey, we take it seriously too, here's our part. And because you look at 1/3 of the internet, that's crazy. Think about that for a minute. To have a piece of software basically failing this horribly and yet power this much of the internet, you're saying this much of the internet we don't want this group of people to use. That's kind of disturbing to me, because the internet really is about letting anyone access knowledge and information and communicate across any barrier, whether it's geographic, whether you're in Canada and I'm in the Philippines, or whether you're blind and someone else is deaf. Having the ability to communicate is the whole point, in my opinion, of what the internet's about. What we do, what other people do, it's about communication. And having a tool that's limiting that communication is kind of sad. And I think that WordPress.org and Automatic has a moral obligation to step up and say, hey, let's do something about this. We're not going to solve it all, but we're going to get as close as we can.
I think that's a great place to leave it today. Thank you again so much for joining me. We're going to set up a next episode very soon. If you guys have any topics that you'd like us to cover, anything that you think need to be picked apart in kind of WordPress or online business, please let us know. You can contact us on presstitan.com.